Before a war is won on the battlefield, it is won in the mind. On March 2nd, 2026, that principle became brutally real. News alerts flashed across 1 billion screens. Social media feeds became a blur of unconfirmed reports. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had issued a statement claiming a ballistic missile strike directly on the office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But the payload of that statement wasn't in the claim of the strike itself. It was in 3 carefully chosen words. Netanyahu's fate, the statement said, was unclear. 1 word, and a global information vacuum was created. The world wasn't just watching a war. It was paralyzed, asking a single question.
But what if that question was the entire point? What if the missile was never the real weapon? Because the real weapon wasn't a projectile, it was a sentence. And what you are watching is the slow, careful disarming of that information bomb. On the 3rd day of the war, March 2nd, 2026, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps didn't just issue a vague threat. This was a statement of surgical precision. They named the missile the Khaybar Shikan. They named the targets, the office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and the personal location of the Israeli Air Force commander. And we know this wording is not rumor or social media fog, because outlets as far apart as Xinhua and Iran International carried the same phrasing from the IRGC statement. This is the kind of hard, specific line, missile type, target set, timestamp, that risk desks and war rooms actually trade and plan around. But after listing those credible, verifiable specifics, they delivered the psychological payload. A single engineered phrase, Netanyahu's fate is unknown. That's the detonation. It fuses the hard credibility of a named weapon system with the paralyzing ambiguity of an open question. This was never designed to create a physical crater. It was designed to sow doubt. Because once you publicly say Netanyahu's fate is unknown, every newsroom and telegram channel runs with that line. And for a few crucial hours, no one outside the bunker can say who is actually in charge. That uncertainty travels fast. Israeli citizens start asking who is giving the orders, and in Washington the question becomes whether the partner you rely on for rapid decisions still has an intact chain of command. What you're actually seeing is Tehran probing not just Israel's air defenses, but the stability of its leadership architecture itself. Now, in any conventional conflict, a claimed strike on a head of state demands an immediate, overwhelming response to re-establish control. In Tel Aviv, in Washington, and on trading floors that live off this kind of headline risk, everyone was watching for the same signal. A visible, decisive Israeli countermove that would close the question and reassert authority. But what came back wasn't a missile launch. It was something far more revealing. A vacuum where there should have been a show of strength. No clear statement, no instantly visible retaliation. Just an open space everyone else had to interpret. And understanding that vacuum is the key to this entire conflict. The official reply, when it landed, was not a show of force. It was a digital whisper. A short text-only statement issued from the Prime Minister's office. A few lines of text dismissing the Iranian claim as fake news. That was it. Against the detailed, high-resolution narrative Iran had just broadcast to the world, Israel responded with the digital equivalent of a shrug. In an information war, this wasn't just bringing a knife to a gunfight. It was showing up with a folded-up piece of paper. The global audience, now conditioned by Iran's specific claims, was looking for one thing: proof of life. A live video. A time-stamped photo of the leader, looking vital and in command. The text-only denial provided none of that. It was an answer, but it answered the wrong question. And this is where a critical pre-existing condition turned a tactical error into a strategic catastrophe. Since February 28th, the Israeli military had imposed a strict wartime media censorship. No live broadcasts from sensitive locations, no independent images of intercepts or their impacts. A leader would normally appear on camera within minutes to quash such a rumor. It's crisis comms 101. But because of the media blackout, they themselves had imposed this was impossible. They had built their own cage, and the world was now watching them rattle its bars. What you're actually seeing here is the creation of a perfect information vacuum. In newsrooms from New York to London, producers were hitting refresh on their terminals, finding nothing. In intelligence hubs, analysts stared at satellite feeds showing an intact building, but no signs of life. And on social media, the vacuum was being filled with a firestorm of conspiracy. The digital noise was deafening, but from Jerusalem, an echoing silence. Empty podiums that spoke louder than any press release. This demonstrates a core law of this new battlefield. In a vacuum, every unanswered question becomes its own kind of answer. The lack of proof was no longer a neutral variable. It was perceived by millions around the world as proof. Proof of a cover-up. Proof that the worst was true. The hours began to tick by. Then a full day. Then two. The absence of a counter-narrative, the absence of the man himself, started to solidify. And the vacuum was no longer just an absence of information. It began to take on a weight, a pressure of its own. It was a quiet that grew so loud, it began to scream. The scream of that silence was answered with more silence. Day one after the Iranian claim, nothing. The world watched and waited for one simple, uncomplicated thing. For Benjamin Netanyahu to appear on camera. Alive and well. A press conference, a live address, anything to break the spell. Day two. Still nothing. His office issued a written statement, just text on a page, but no video. Regional reporting from outlets like Yeni Safak noted the near-total public absence. This wasn't just a media strategy, this was a verifiable data point, a void. Day 3. Now the silence has a momentum of its own. Iranian-linked media are running rampant with the narrative, amplifying rumors that he was wounded, or worse. And still, the only response from the Prime Minister's office is the digital equivalent of a closed door. By day 4, the pressure has become immense. And you have to understand, even staunch supporters, even the most loyal allies, were starting to ask the obvious question. In a world of smartphones and 24/7 connectivity, why not just a simple 30-second video? I'm fine, we're strong, we will prevail. It's the easiest thing in the world to do. The longer the silence dragged on, the more the silence itself became the message. What you're actually seeing here is the Iranian narrative achieving escape velocity. The verifiable absence from the public eye was the fuel. It gave the story that something serious had happened, a story born in Tehran, immense credibility on the world stage. The pressure point was no longer just in Tel Aviv. The crisis of credibility was now metastasizing. The real question, the one that mattered for global markets and military postures, was now being asked in Washington, D.C. They were watching the same void, and they were waiting for an answer too. For a moment, it looked like Washington was about to get its answer. At the peak of the crisis, the flight schedules were set. Two of Donald Trump's envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, were preparing to fly to Israel, the first senior US visit planned since the war began on February 28th. This was supposed to be the reset. Flags on the tarmac, handshakes for the cameras, a united front. For a world watching an information blackout around Israel's leadership, this trip was meant to be the full stop, the moment the United States would stand beside its ally and finally silence the speculation. Then, March 10th happened. On March 10th, the visit was cancelled, abruptly. The direct meeting with Netanyahu was scrubbed. No official reason, no new date. From Israel's most important ally, there was only deliberate silence. According to reporting in both the Jerusalem Post and Axios, this wasn't a scheduling issue. Sources tied the cancellation directly to Washington's shock at the scale of uncoordinated Israeli military strikes. The message was clear. The White House was no longer prepared to pretend everything was fine. That abrupt snub marked the first public, undeniable fracture in the US-Israel wartime alliance since the fighting began. That fracture tells you the mystery was never really about one man's 4-day silence. We started with a smaller question. For 4 days, where was Netanyahu? And why was there a blackout on his location and movements? The trail from that question led to a bigger, more important one. What exactly snapped inside the US-Israel alliance? Is the alliance itself broken? Because what you are watching now is not simply a mystery about a prime minister. What you are watching is a war within the war. This was the moment the hidden crack in the alliance stopped being a rumor and became visible. For those who track these signals, did you see it first in the oil futures curve or in defense stock volatility before the headlines caught up? Let me know in the comments. But a public snub this severe, this strategically significant, never happens in a vacuum. It is a symptom. What you're actually seeing is a visible pressure point, the sound a load-bearing wall makes just before it fails. You've now seen the political fracture. If you don't understand the economic and energy market pressure that forced it open, the story the price of oil was already telling before March 10th, then you've missed the point. That story begins with a fundamental and irreconcilable divergence in war aims. For Israel, the objective was existential, the total and permanent destruction of Iran's war-making potential. But for the United States, the initial mission, Operation Epic Fury, had already failed. Analysis from CSIS confirmed what reporting in the Times of Israel suggested. Washington's objective had pivoted from regime change to damage control. They were looking for an exit. That divergence created the fracture line, but the trigger that broke it wide open was pulled by Israel, acting alone. Their unilateral strikes on multiple Iranian oil depots and refineries went far beyond any agreed-upon scope of engagement. The result was immediate, and it registered not on the battlefield, but on every trading screen in the world. You don't have to take my word for it. Believe the market. While politicians spoke of an unbreakable bond, Brent crude told the real story. The price spiked to nearly $120 a barrel, its highest point since 2022. For investors and strategists, that move was the market's verdict on alliance cohesion. The moment pricing stopped believing the speeches. The larger story this price action was pointing toward was simple. The crack in the alliance was already priced in before a single press conference was held, and that price spike had a direct cost inside the United States. The leap from pre-strike levels into the $120 range was not noise. It met the kind of 10% plus oil shock Morgan Stanley had modeled. Their analysis from the period was clear. A 10% shock to oil prices lifts US consumer price inflation by approximately 0.35% within 3 months. In an election year, that incremental inflation is politically radioactive. This is where the pressure became unbearable. Iran's information operations ruthlessly exploited this economic vulnerability, fanning the flames of public discontent. Through state media and coordinated online campaigns, Tehran-linked messaging hammered a single theme. Higher gas prices and thinner paychecks were the epic fury tax. Your household footing the bill for someone else's war. Every tick higher at the pump was framed as proof that Washington cared more about Tel Aviv than about American families. In that information environment, the polling damage was predictable. A Reuters Ipsos survey from March 2026 captured the impact. Public approval for the US role in Operation Epic Fury had plummeted to just 27%, a reflection of how effectively the war had been reframed as an attack on Americans' cost of living. So let's trace the causal chain. Israel hits Iranian oil. Brent crude hits $120. The move bleeds into inflation expectations. Iran's information war rides that pain and ties it directly to epic fury in every feed. Domestic political support for the war collapses. The White House had no other move. It was forced to publicly and brutally apply the brakes on its ally. But what you've just seen wasn't a lucky shot by Iran. It was doctrine, a playbook for shattering a superior foe, written not in Tehran in 2026, but in the final decisive months of World War II. To truly understand how Iran engineered this collapse, you first have to understand what Eisenhower's logisticians learned about oil, steel, and the true center of gravity on the eve of D-Day. Spring 1944. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower is faced with a problem of physics and fear. On paper, he commands the largest amphibious invasion force in human history. But he knows that physical superiority is not enough. A direct assault on Hitler's fortified Atlantic Wall in Normandy is a meat grinder in waiting, a potential failure of catastrophic proportions. He understood a core truth of warfare. The battle must first be won, not on the beaches, but in the mind of the German High Command. And so, he authorized one of the most brilliant deceptions ever conceived. Operation Bodyguard. What you're actually seeing here is the birth of a ghost army. In the fields of Kent, across from Pas de Calais, an entire fictional force, the first US Army Group, or Fusagi, was willed into existence. It was commanded by a general the Germans feared above all others, George S. Patton. But its soldiers were phantoms. Its divisions were a mirage. Imagine German reconnaissance planes flying overhead, their cameras capturing images of vast motor pools. But down below, the tanks glistening in the English sun weren't steel. They were inflatable rubber, meticulously crafted decoys. In German listening posts across the channel, operators heard the constant crackle of radio traffic. Fake orders for troop movements, requisitions for supplies, the entire logistical hum of an army preparing to attack, but it was all a script, broadcast into the ether to build a reality that did not exist. The result was decisive. On June 6, 1944, as the real Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Hitler remained convinced it was a feint. The main event, the real attack by Patton's massive army, was still coming at Pas de Calais. For weeks, he kept his most elite panzer divisions waiting there, paralyzed by a ghost. That information vacuum, engineered by Eisenhower, saved thousands of Allied lives and secured victory in the West. As Eisenhower himself later said, psychological warfare has proven its right to a place of dignity in our military arsenal. Just as Eisenhower created a vacuum of certainty for Hitler, Iran created a vacuum of certainty for the world about Netanyahu. The principle is identical and timeless. A fractured mind leads to a fractured response. But the story doesn't end there. The fracture in the Western Alliance, as damaging as it is merely a first-order effect. It's the initial, visible explosion. What we need to look at now is the second-order effect. The thing the market hasn't priced in, It's what the intelligence community refers to as the doomsday calculation, and it represents the true endgame. So, what is the doomsday calculation? If you thought the broken alliance was the worst case scenario, you haven't seen the real endgame. This is not about losing a friend, it's about losing the entire chessboard. The second order effect is this: Iran isn't just striking Israel. What you're actually seeing is a coordinated campaign by its proxies, hitting US bases and assets in allied Gulf states. We have confirmed reporting from sources like the Sufan Center and the Associated Press on strikes in Bahrain, the UAE, and Kuwait. Iran is deliberately spreading the cost of the conflict to America's other regional partners. And the pressure is working. Publicly, these nations release careful statements declaring their territories cannot be used for retaliatory attacks against Iran. But behind the scenes, what I'm describing are frantic high-level diplomatic calls from Riyadh and Abu Dhabi to Washington. The message is desperate and clear. Your conflict is setting our economies on fire. Our domestic stability is at risk. You must end this. This leads to the final terrifying piece of the calculation. The deepest existential fear in Tel Aviv is not another missile. It's that these Gulf nations, under unbearable pressure, will demand the complete withdrawal of all US forces from their soil. This move would instantly shatter the entire American security architecture in the Middle East, effectively removing the board itself. It would leave Israel utterly, totally isolated against a hostile region led by Iran. That is the nightmare scenario. A threat far greater than any warhead. This is the new reality. The security umbrella that has defined the region for 50 years is being systematically dismantled. The risk has been repriced. So given this, what is the correct move? How do we position for what comes next? To understand the correct move, you have to accept that the initial mystery, where was Benjamin Netanyahu, was a deliberate misdirection. In the end, it didn't matter. His physical status was irrelevant. The silence itself and the fracture it exposed was the real outcome. The information bomb's true target was never a single man, but the alliance architecture around him. And on that target, it was a direct hit. The lasting damage is the now public crack in the US-Israel relationship. What you're seeing is the strategic victory of Iran's psychological operation, a planted doubt that forces every decision maker to ask, who is actually in charge over there, and are they still together? When that question is live, joint decisions slow, regional partners hedge with alternative security backstops, and deterrent softens because no one is sure how unified the response will be. That doubt is the new operating reality, and it hardwires a higher risk premium into anything exposed to the Middle East. Structural repricing in markets means the extra compensation investors demand doesn't snap back. Regional credit trades on wider spreads and protection on energy and regional equity stays more expensive than before the information strike. Yet most desks are still treating this as a passing headline cycle, not a fracture in the alliance foundation, which is why the repricing is still only partial. In parallel, 2 decades of Middle East wars have produced deep political fatigue in the United States. There is very little public appetite for new, direct, large-scale interventions. That public constraint forces policymakers to pull back on open-ended guarantees, and allies register it even if the speeches stay bullish. So alliances quietly recalibrate. Partners diversify their security ties, and adversaries probe more aggressively at the margins. That slow, grinding recalibration is the second-order effect of a single successful information strike. The real story is told in the gap between official rhetoric and market reality. The next time you hear a politician insist an alliance is unbreakable or rock solid, check the price of oil and the VEX, the market's fear gauge. Then look at regional credit spreads. If the speeches are smooth, but those prices are quietly embedding higher volatility and wider spreads, the fracture is already being priced in. That gap between the microphone and the screen is where you find the leading indicator. Treat it as a standing diagnostic. In any future alliance crisis, map the distance between what leaders say and how core risk instruments trade, and you'll see where the pressure is building before it shows up in policy. If this way of decoding the real signals behind the noise is useful to your decisions, subscribe for more ahead of the headlines analysis and hit the like button so the platform knows this is the signal you want.